Starcitizen just released a very interesting read-through of the 3.18 and 3.19 patch Post Mortem. This is where CIG basically investigates what went right and what went wrong in the previous patches, which includes a deep dive into a lot of the features and what they think about them. It's a pretty interesting read, and they even mention, dare I say it, 4.0 and server meshing. So the beginning of the post goes over the whole 3.18 launch and what happened, and here's an excerpt that I found interesting. When the moment of truth came and Alpha 3.18 shipped to live, the shock to the system was beyond what we had projected. While it's true that we expected PES to create a rough experience initially, as we ironed out the issues that could only expose themselves at massive scale, and we warned as much, to say that we were surprised by the depth of the chaos from the PES launch would be an understatement. CIG then goes on to discuss more of the details of how it broke everything, but if you were around for the launch of 3.18, basically you probably remember not being able to log in, and when you could log in, nothing working in the game entirely. CIG then wraps up their explanation of the launch fiasco with, I think, one of the most interesting paragraphs in the whole post, and it reads as this. As we begin to roll out the replication layer split and crash recovery, two things now enabled by PES, we will do so gradually, and as we begin to deliver server meshing, we will create dedicated testing channels to harden those technologies further and implement standards and thresholds before we graduate them to the PTU and then live. You'll start to see the ramifications of that later in the year and hear more from us about our new approach to deploying potentially disruptive and game-changing new tech to the game service. But it comes down to us truly committing to preserving the experience for the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who now play Starcitizen as a live service game, albeit an alpha still in development. So this statement from CIG is pretty loaded. Firstly, it talks about rolling out server meshing in 4.0 in a more gradual way to basically appease the player base that plays their game like a live service game, even though it's an alpha title. And this is something that I've talked about a lot in the past, that at some point, and it's sort of a gray area, CIG's test universe, where they were just showing off their tech, turned into a live service experience. It got good enough to the point where certain players were coming in and playing more regularly. Obviously, it's not good enough for the masses to enjoy, but it's good enough for a lot of people to enjoy. And when they're trying to roll out this massive tech that ultimately breaks the game for a while, it's probably disastrous to not just the player happiness, but frankly, the funding of Starcitizen, right? If people aren't able to play the game and experience all the ships that they bought and stuff, well, I'd imagine less money's going to start rolling in. So CIG really does need to put the preservation of the online experience at the forefront at this point, which is a challenge in and of itself because they still need to roll out some very foundational tech to the game that could ultimately require a lot of mass scale testing and ultimately break the game again. However, they do address this later in the post. When talking about what they'll do better in their future plans, they say this. Going forward, we'll finalize and use the new cloud test launcher to adequately stress test the game shards at scale. This tool will simulate player behavior and allow QA and the engineers to connect multiple modified game clients to the shard. By utilizing cloud computing resources, effective stress testing can be conducted, which will help identify and address issues related to heavy loaded servers before moving to live. The team responsible for PES has now moved on to static server meshing and are embracing a transformation approach to the new project. Unlike PES, this foundational technology can be integrated into the code base gradually, avoiding a disruptive Big Bang approach. Parts of the server meshing tech are already available to the game team for testing compatibility with their game features. Combined with the cloud test launcher, this approach aims to facilitate a smoother integration process for static server meshing. Now, this is pretty phenomenal news from CIG. They're basically saying that we're not going to have a repeat of 3.18 with 4.0 where we have to big bang the game and just blow everything up and sort of fix things as we go, while the overall player base ends up being a bunch of guinea pigs on a large-scale test. This new cloud-based testing system that they have sounds great as well, so if they do need to test things at scale, hopefully the cloud-based clients can accurately replicate players trying to connect to the game and perform various tasks. This sounds very promising, and I'm glad they've developed developed a system for it. The other really promising aspect of this is just the lack of the big bang approach and being able to roll out server meshing features more gradually. It sounds like the biggest bang of this whole update will probably be when they add Pyro, where they'll have two systems potentially operating on different servers, or if they're going to start operating other things on different servers before that and maybe roll it out much more slowly. But it does sound promising, and it sounds like the upgrade also from static server meshing to dynamic server meshing might also have the same ability to be more gradual rather than having to do it all at once, where you can start having some features start behaving more dynamically. And if that works out well, then upgrade it to more features and more until everything's dynamic. Now, in terms of timeline, they mentioned discussing or revealing a lot more of this stuff toward the end of the year. I don't think that means we're going to be getting 4.0 by the end of the year, even though that was the initial estimates or the most recent estimates from talking with everybody I know who is probably more well connected to the Starcitizen information hub than me. They seem to be projecting, next year, almost certainly for 4.0. It just seems too unrealistic at this point, but who knows? We have CitizenCon coming up and we're bound to get a huge information dump from that. Now, the rest of the blog post goes over a ton of the features and ships and things that were implemented in both 3.18 and 3.19 outside of the big ticket items. Rivers was an interesting topic where they discussed how the river tool has come a long way, but it just wasn't being automated enough, where if you want to fill up an entire planet with rivers, well, those rivers have got to look pretty good and you can't go in and hand tweak every single one of them. So they're progressing towards a better tool that should hopefully allow them to add rivers to an entire planet with minimal manual work. And similar messaging was communicated with the new cave systems. They're happy with the way the new sand caves work. They don't want to spend as much time manually integrating them. So they're basically working on a bunch of new cave types, new cave rooms, ways to connect them together and create bigger cavities, and also integrating it to a more automated system so that they can fill up a planet with a bunch of cool caves, and then they will replace the old caves and I assume attach all the mission systems to the caves once again. Now, they also talked about the updated Jumptown events, saying that they actually had really high participation, which is good. However, there was a ton of bugs surrounding them, so obviously they're going to work on getting all those bugs ironed out, but they also want to create the Jumptown environment in the new Rastar tools and drop it into different environments on different planets. And they mentioned forests, so I think that means Jumptown is coming to Microtech at some point in the future. And I think that sounds really cool, rather than having just sort of a barren wasteland surrounding this production facility. Having a forest and more interesting topography could make the combat and the tactics much more interesting. CIG also addressed, or sort of addressed, the Vulture and the new salvage gameplay. The big issue with the Vulture, at least in my eyes, is the incredibly bad gameplay mechanic of having to leave the pilot seat after you salvage a little bit of material, go into the cargo bay, move some boxes around so that the cargo dispenser can then dispense more salvage stuff, get back into the pilot seat and continue doing this. You have to do this multiple times per run. It's really weird, awkward, unnecessary, not fun. It's like if you're watching some guy in an excavator dig a little bit of dirt out, put it into a dump truck, then have to get out of the excavator, move the dump truck, drive another one over, and then get back in the excavator. It's just silly. The tools are designed around more efficient workflow, and the Vulture just doesn't make any sense in my eyes. But CIG didn't really address this. They said that the gameplay mechanics were somewhat a product of the salvage mechanic evolving over time to require more manual input than initially expected during the vehicle's concept in 2018. They don't, however, mention if they're going to go back and fix this terrible mechanic, because I would love to be a salvager, but I'm simply not going to go through that gameplay loop to do it. And continuing in the same thing of ships whose designs don't quite live up to the expectations, they do address the RSI Scorpius and Teres, and they say this: with master modes and new MFDs coming in the future, we should see the co-pilot get more gameplay features rather than being half passenger, half button presser. Obviously, if you're familiar with the Antares, the second pilot just sits back there and presses a button to activate the EMP, which is insanely boring and just silly. Like, obviously the pilot themselves should be able to do this. I think this is a knock-on effect of just in general co-pilots in the game not really having much to do, and CIG really has to sort of integrate a lot more scanning and shield manipulation and whatever so that a co-pilot can actually make a ship a lot better. And if the co-pilot in the Antares gets those abilities, it could actually be much more interesting and make it a much more interesting fighter, or effective fighter rather. But again, that's waiting on a lot of features down the road that will hopefully improve more ships than just the Antares. Now, they do go over a ton of other stuff in this, like PTV racetracks, security post Korea, time trials, infiltrate missions, prison activities, cargo stuff, hull scraping, new player experience, tractor beam attach and detach mechanics, mining rebalances, and generally the takeaway from a lot of this stuff is just they're looking at what did and didn't work with their workflows, and they're trying to update it so that teams get the information and access to the tools that they need in a more timely manner to address any sort of hiccups or problems with the final product. And that's more or less it, just giving you some insight into what they're thinking as a company, how they've ingested the feedback and the actual rollout of all these features. It's nice to finally get this post-mortem for 3.18 and 3.19. It sucks that it took so long, but also 3.18 was so huge and it did so much stuff. They probably were still trying to figure out their processes for the next leg of the journey and wanted something more reassuring to tell us rather than being like, yeah, this exploded and was really hard to deal with and we're sorry. And I feel a bit more reassured by this. The gradual rollout for 4.0 sounds like the most promising and the least frightening aspect of the big 4.0 update, because like anybody who's trying to play Starcitizen more regularly, we don't want another 3.18 that explodes everything. We want some gradual rollouts. We expect some bugs along the way, but preferably ones that don't explode the whole experience for weeks on end. And this is likely the biggest information dump that we're going to get until the end of October when CitizenCon goes live. Of course, I'll be covering that and any sort of other update that happens along the way. As always, guys, I hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments if there's any other points that you thought were standout in particular, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap signing off.